Next reporter, please.
So good day, sir. I'm Engineer Ambriel from Group 5. We're designated to discuss regards with the environmental crisis. So there is something answered correlation with the what is the relationship of population growth to development. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So first is the relationship between population growth and economic development may be summarized in words of Robert McNamara, the past president of the World Bank. He described it as the most difficult issue of our era. It is with immune, it's controversial, it is subtle above all. It is immeasurable, complex, and massive. Once remarked that the country's greatest wealth is its people. Next slide, please. So, first, what is the benefits of a function as a method of development? Just, just, in population, further down the back on important initiative growth and services na potential entrepreneur and good and business will this or launch in mass production and effect may to the next slide. The size of the domestic market of country not only depend on the numbers but also the per capita income level. Given in the some low level of income, head country India offers a more durable setting up capital goods industries which depends as much on scale their success. Thirdly, an increase in population rate in economies and production distribution of labor extension of the market. So, mga kasagaran nakita nga benefit population growth. So, next slide please. So, there are some na argued in terms of what is population growth based on the so most common philosophers nga say na nagbuhat sa isip that is kung altos slide please. In the year Kana madungog ra boss.
Dungog ra.
So si Thomas Robert Malthus ni conflict siya regards with the principle of population growth. So, as he stated nga in his essay that the principle of population, it proved to be one of the most enduring works of the time. Malthus' fundamental argument was that population growth will inevitably collide with diminishing returns. Diminishing returns imply that adding more labor to a fixed quantity of land increases output, but by ever smaller amounts. Eventually, Malthus concluded increases in food production would be too small to sustain the increased number of human beings who consume that output. As the population continued to grow unchecked, the number of people would eventually outstrip the ability of the land to generate enough food. There would be inevitable a Malthusian trough as starvation becomes the primary check to population growth, a point which the world is so no longer able to meet the food requirements of the population, and starvation becomes the primary check to population growth. Then, a Malthusian trap is illustrated. Nabuhat sa illustration na called Malthusian trap that can determine the total amount of food needed by multiplying the population in any period by the amount of food required to keep one person alive. Next slide, please. So, for example, sa Malthusian trap na i-conclude ni Malthus, the population growth at a fixed rate, the amount of food required will be increased exponentially, but that the output of food increases only by a constant amount each period. Given two different growth processes, food requirements would eventually cap food production. The population hits the substances level of food production at the Malthusian trap. Next slide, please. So what happens in Malthusian trap? Clearly, there is not enough to support population growth implied by the food required curve. Instead, people's population begins rising artificially held in check by food produce curve. Starvation becomes the limiting force. Then the population leaves a margin of subsistence. For Malthus, the long run for human beings was a standard barely sufficient to keep them alive. As put it, the view has a melancholy hope. Then happily Malthus' prediction did not match the experience of Western societies in the 19th and 20th centuries. One weakness of his argument is the if to take into account the gains output that could be achieved through increased use of physical capital and new technologies in agriculture. Increasing the amount of capital per worker in the form of machineries, improved seeding and fertilization have made possible increase in agricultural output. At the same time, the supply of labor was rising. Then agricultural productivity rose rapidly in the United States over the last 2 centuries. Yes, the opposite of the fall productivity expected by Malthus, productivity has continued to expand. Then, Malthus was wrong as well as the relationship between population growth and income. He believed that increase in would boost population growth. Next slide, please. So, as you can see in panel A showed the low nation had much higher fertility rates. Births per during the year 2000 and 2005 than the high-income family. We see that low-income nation had a much higher rate of population growth during the year 1975 and year 2005 period. Next slide, please. So, therefore, they have a conclusion stating that plus and minus points economy include the hence to developments in these are not to be attributed with population growth. The greatest and real obstacle to development and undevelopment potentialities for development are identified in their development programs of the government, and this is categorize their levels of income and living. So further, they argue that there is no population bomb in these countries. The myth of overpopulation causing underdevelopment be giving up in any list of economic development be added that a slowing down of population contribute to our development prospects. So what is so growth may not be source of a gender. Most population growth may be either favorably or unfavorable to development, depending on where and when and how it takes place. So that will be all. Thank.
So good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Engine Cadet Ybañez, and I will be discussing about what is the relationship of population growth to the future of globalization. So next slide. So the impact of population to globalization. Historically, population growth has served as an impetus for global exploration, international migration, and colonization. But in recent years, population dynamics have influenced globalization through the effects on the distribution of labor and capital. Differences between each country's supply of labor and capital have an important influence on trade, foreign investment, and international migration. So next slide. Countries with limited supply of one of these economic resources gain by cooperating with countries that have an abundant supply. Either the resources themselves can be exchanged through the export of labor, which is called migration, or capital, which is foreign investment, or the countries can specialize in the production of final goods and services in which they have a comparative advantage and then engage in trade. Next slide. So countries at an early stage in the demographic transition tend to be labor exporters. So exporters meaning they send laborers that will migrate to other countries. Capital importers and producers of labor-intensive goods and services. On the other hand, countries at a late stage in the demographic transition tend to be labor importers, capital exporters, and producers of capital and skill-intensive goods and services. So next slide. So Hong Kong and Singapore. Hong Kong and Singapore are among the first Asian countries to achieve low fertility, so they become major importers of labor. So they receive migrants in their countries to work and to provide their families standard of living. Then the Philippines and India are the two countries at an early stage of fertility transition are leading labor exporters. So they export laborers to other countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, and US. So next slide. In many developing countries, working age populations will continue to expand for several decades, while population aging will raise dependency ratios in Japan, Europe, and to the lesser extent, the United States. Given these demographic trends, Asia and other developing regions should be able to increase their share of global manufacturing production. Lower dependency ratios in these countries will help an opportunity to export, expansion, and rapid economic growth. So there are a lot of good and bad effects of population growth to the future of globalization. So the size, growth, and age structure of national population also affect globalization. Population change influences the movement of people, products, and investment capital among countries. Favorable changes in population age structure also have a positive influence on economic growth. But on the other side of the coin, if the population will rapidly increase, so the sustainability and the resources will be limited for the country and for the people. So that's all. Thank you.
Marat ka